We're going to go ahead and call this meeting to order. We always like to start on time and end on time. So this is the monthly meeting of the Board of Education, City of St. Louis Ad Hoc Legislative Committee. My name is Matt Davis. I am the chair. Tonight's meeting is dedicated once again to a special topic. We're going to be talking specifically about how we can support our students who are dealing with housing insecurity. And to that end, we have invited some special guests from the community and community organizations to join us. Since we don't all necessarily know each other, at least starting with the table, if we could go around the room and introduce ourselves. Ms. Kelso, would you like to start?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Emily Kelso. I'm a parent of 3 children in St. Louis Public Schools, and I'm also the chair of the Parent Action Council, which is like the PTO for the district.
Byron Clemens, a communications specialist for AFT St. Louis, Local 420.
Hi, I'm Colleen Dom, and I am the Chief Advancement Advocacy Officer at Covenant House, Missouri.
All right. I'm Yusef Skagen, the Director of the Department of Human Services for the City of St. Louis.
Good evening, Calvin Adams, Superintendent, St. Louis Public School District.
Hi there, Christina Gracia, 6th Ward Alderwoman, City of St. Louis.
Deidre Thomas Murray. I am the Students in Transition Coordinator for St. Louis Public Schools, where we provide services to homeless and foster care students.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Nicole Williams. I serve as the Chief of Staff to Dr. Kelvin Adams here in the St. Louis Public Schools.
Thank you all. And just for the people watching at home on the live stream, we do have some other administrators, member from the foundation who are also in the audience, and there's a microphone there. So please feel free to join the conversation at any time. Just a little bit of a background for what brings us here tonight. Earlier this year, the Board of Education formed this committee to focus on legislative priorities and our legislative platform, focusing mainly on this next legislative session in Jeff City. But as we were beginning our work and looking over the priorities that we've had in previous years, we decided to focus on 3 priorities in particular that were important to us. Those 3 priorities are to protect the local funding formula for funding for St. Louis Public Schools. And also, then we looked at 2 other issues that were affect us every year, but were affecting us in particular in the pandemic. And that is to seek funding to deal with the effects of trauma on our students. And also this issue tonight, which was sort of a broader issue of how we can come together and advocate for resources and services for our students in transition, students that are affected by housing insecurity. This process right now is just sort of an informal discussion. We wanted to have a roundtable discussion and just sort of frame the issues. One is to inform members of the Board of Education as we go and we make decisions on this, but also to inform our community and to inform this committee as well as we begin our advocacy and our legislative work, especially going into next year. So I like to make it sort of an informal roundtable discussion, so please feel free to join in. But I did want to start with Ms. Thomas Murray, who is our resident expert on the subject. And I kind of wanted you to just talk a little bit about your work, but I also, if you can, talk about the extent of the problem, both in the quantitative factor, but also just sort of on a day-to-day basis, how these issues affect our students and what you see.
Thank you. Trying to move a little closer. So the Students in Transition Office, we provide educational support to students who are homeless. And our homeless students become homeless for various reasons. Death of a parent, incarceration of a parent, evictions, financial insecurity, and a host of other challenges. And so we basically provide support and intervention to students who have housing challenges and are highly mobile. And most of our services are centered around the federal law, which kinds of dictates how homeless services should be supported in the educational arena. I think that some of the challenges with housing insecurity is HUD's law looks a lot different than the McKinney-Vento federal law. And so families who are living in doubled up situations, they're not considered homeless under HUD's law. And so under the McKinney-Vento, families that are living doubled up is considered substandard housing. And so the challenge with that is, and I think I shared this in an interview yesterday, when you have holidays and seasonal activities and festivities that come up, and folk are already stressed and they're living in stressful conditions, it just exacerbates the problem and leads to probably domestic violence and a host of other issues. And at St. Louis Public Schools, we provide as much support as we can within the confines of the law. And so our families who are living doubled up or unsheltered, we've been providing with the support of air mattresses, heaters, blankets, pillows, as much as we can do. I think one of the challenges for homeless families is they don't have social capital. They don't have the capacity to, we talk about using a lifeline, calling a friend, and a host of other issues. The only way to get this work done is to collectively work together. We're not a social service entity, agency, but we're providing social services. And so I often say, to create change, we must change. And I'm going to pause on that. I don't know if there's any questions.
No, thank you. So just, I kind of want to just, so everybody understands and how McKinney-Vento works. It requires, for a student to qualify for services, it requires an application. Is that right?
So we identify students through the intake process, and that support is delivered through our school social workers, school counselors, FCS secretaries, and even partnering agencies. We email the forms. If the family's in your office, we're not going to ask the family to come here. We're going to email that document as an effort to respect their financial capacity, because a lot of families do not have the monies to go back and forth between the district and other agencies. So that's how we identify students. We support students as an effort to promote academic success through providing transportation, through providing tutoring, and ensuring that their school fees are taken care of. Whatever those supports are that's outlined in the law, those are the services that we provide. I just can't remember them all right now.
Well, and my question is kind of getting to, so we quantify these students because it requires reporting to the federal government. DESE collects this information. And I know this year is early, and I know this year is weird, but generally speaking, how many students are we talking about?
So for the past 5 to 7 years, we've identified over 5,000 students. When the pandemic hit, it impaired our efforts to identify students. And I think to date, we have 3,277 students. Some students have withdrawn or transferred. However, the law dictates that we identify them the entire school year, even if they only experience homelessness for one day. So this is a federal law that is mandated by every school district throughout the US to have a homeless liaison to identify homeless students as well as foster.
So generally speaking, it's 15 to 20% of the students we serve qualify.
Yes.
I just want to, that number shocks me every time I hear it. And so I just want to make sure that we have that number out there and repeat it. And I looked at the DESE data for other school districts. Nobody comes close to that. I think the next highest one was Kansas City, which was around 600. Still just an abominable number, but I think that we're in multiples of that. It's just hard for, it's just really kind of hard to believe. And I don't want that number to ever be desensitized because it's an overwhelming problem. Before we kind of move on, and maybe I'll turn to our educators here, and Dr. Roberts is here as well, because as the Board of Education, obviously, you said we're not a social service agency, we're an education agency, and our moral imperative of the Board of Education, one of them is to eliminate the achievement gap for all of our students. But this is a major impediment. This, along with trauma, and you can talk about how trauma and this issue are completely intertwined, are an impediment. And I don't know if Dr. Williams, Dr. Adams, if you could just talk a little bit about the difficulty in educating students that come to our schools with these economic imperatives, with the housing insecurity, the mobility issues, how that plays into it.
So thank you, Mr. Davis. I think that's a critical question as we talk about educating every child every day in every classroom. I think Ms. Murray Thomas really framed it well when we think about how we classify students particularly and how we serve students. What are the interventions that we put in place? Because we know students self-identify or families self-identify, we know those numbers are much higher than the numbers that we've articulated here. And so that's a challenge that we as a school system have to be very intentional and thoughtful about how we, first of all, outreach to parents, communicate with parents, and ensure that parents and families understand that we are here to support them with food insecurity, which is a huge challenge in our communities. And I see Ms. Kelso, our president of PAC, affirming that, understanding how we support them with living in, many families living in multiple dwellings, for example. How do we support students in those particular environments? And the stress, as we know, that comes with the pandemic, food insecurity, families living in, multiple families living in dwellings, one dwelling. Issues particularly created around the idea of how do we educate every child? In these variables traumatically impact how we educate and support every child every day in every classroom. And so I think bringing this, this particular issue to the forefront in ways that we can have meaningful dialogue, how we bring every agency in the city of St. Louis to the resources to bear to address this challenge is critically important. And so I do think this conversation this evening, this discourse, this dialogue is essential as we think about the action plans, the interventions that we put in place to serve all children well, which is our core mission as an organization. Dr. Adams?
I'll chime in just a couple of things. Number one, time or not attending school at all, which raises the dropout rate because students exit the school district as a result of challenges of getting to and from school. The multiple transfers, meaning students leaving one school to go to another school as they lose housing. And so that's another large challenge. There's a reason why the district's dropout rate at some point in time was in double digits because we're constantly dropping students and re-enrolling students as they go from one location to another location. One of the other challenges is a challenge around trauma, which I think everybody's talked about, and social emotional issues, because as it's already been indicated, students self-identify themselves, and there's a sense of shame for students as they get into schools and don't feel a part of the school environment because they don't have the stability that other students might have as a result of that. Lastly, and I think it's one of the ones that we don't probably align ourselves with a great deal, the notion of materials and supplies. Students don't have the materials and supplies to complete assignments, i.e. The connection to the internet, as we just went through the notion of the pandemic and giving students access to technology. They were not even stable enough, even when we gave them a hotspot, to be able to connect to the internet because they were moving from one location to another location. And in many cases, did not even want to accept the equipment because they didn't want to be responsible for it if they could not, if it was lost. And Ms. Deidre Murray Thomas and I had a conversation early in the pandemic. They didn't want the technology because they felt in the environments that they were in, it was going to be stolen and they were going to be responsible for it. So I think it's some of the things that we traditionally think about: attendance, materials, social, emotional, but it's just an entire sense of well-being, an entire sense of I don't feel worthy, which drives a number of different issues that happen in schools. So those are just three top of the mind things that we deal with on a regular basis. What Deidre Thomas didn't frame for you is that the cost to transport students from one location to another location, and then move to the county, we provide transportation, bus service, and cab service for them. My last number, because we fight about this all the time, was about $1.9 million just to transport them back and forth from one location to another location, because we want them to be stable, don't want to pull them out of our school district to go to another school district, because that's a whole set of criteria all by itself, or vice versa. So those are just some of the things that we deal with on a regular basis as it relates to the notion of supporting students who are identified as homeless.
I just wanted to figure out how to get my light on. Yeah, I just wanted to add to that piece, and thank you, Dr. Adams, for bringing that up. And so the law does dictate that we provide transportation as an educational support. It's very expensive, and Dr. Adams will soon find that transportation costs will be going up because now the law mandates that these supports are provided to pre-K students as well. And so our job, and I just like to say this to the listeners or whomever's out there, if parents show up at your agency and they have small children, please refer them to the district. Our goal is to catch them early. In fact, I was looking at some research on trauma and what the brain looks like when they're very, very young. I worked as a children's therapist, and I would often say, if we don't treat it, we're bound to repeat it. And so when we identify those behaviors and or get those cues to let us know that these children may have challenges and can benefit from additional support, you know, it's imperative for us as educators to make sure that we're providing those interventions and those supports. Trauma, it does not go away. We live in an area where it's ongoing trauma. I talk about our staff as the working wounded. Your eyes, your ears, that's the gateway to your soul. What you see, what you hear, it changes you. And so children may not have the capacity to say, ouch. Their ouch is tearing up a classroom or being disruptive. And I just think it's high time that we start looking at our approaches to homelessness differently. Because, I mean, the Bible said the poor will forever be among us. And so it's here and we are witnessing it. The pandemic prevented us from being able to properly identify and provide the supports. And I think a lot of families just did not know that St. Louis Public Schools was open. I have the luxury of a window. And so I would see Dr. Adams out there handing out hot spots, directing traffic. We were here. And we want to remind parents that we are here. And we don't know if you're going through if you don't bring it to our attention. We have enough student support services in our district to be able to address those individual challenges. And when I say that, what I'm referencing is our counselors, our FCS, our family community specialists who are posted in every building, our school social workers, and then our partners. And so I just think that I'm glad for the conversation, but the collaboration it will make the impact.
Thanks. So that's a good, Byron, go ahead. Mr. Clemens.
Just want to say a couple things. One thing we know from Maslow in pedagogy, that hierarchy, we have to start with children feeling secure in their home as much as possible, good nutrition, looking at the whole child, the social, emotional piece. Before you get enhanced academic performance, you have to start at that base first. Our children don't exist in a bubble separate from their family. Our families don't exist in a bubble separate from the community. It's all one package. Sometimes we get beat up for academic performance when we have to start at the basics within the community. And I'm certainly glad to hear that transportation piece for pre-K. We've been big advocates for pre-K as a union, and I'm really proud that the district has moved forward with that endeavor. Thank you.
Now, I was just going to say this to you, Byron. The challenge about the pre-K piece is we have a law that says children under 8 years old and 80 pounds should be in a car seat. And then we have federal mandates. And so when our drivers don't touch the children, and so children who enter and exit the vehicles, they have to be able to safely secure themselves. And so, so the law is great, but we still have the challenges. And I think one of the things we need to keep in mind when we talk about the homeless is these children, many have experienced trauma. And to touch them or to move toward them can be threatening. And so, so it's great that it's in the law, but we still have to look at some of the psychosocial challenges as well.
Perhaps some of our corporate friends could help with that.
I wanted to open it up for discussion. Thank you all for sort of laying that out. I think it's important to hear your work, and every time you talk, you give me something else that I never even thought about. So it's always kind of hard to imagine. But I want to open it up to everybody. I want to welcome Mr. D'Agostino from St. Patrick Center. Thank you so much for coming. But we want to hear from you. And like I said, I like to make this sort of an open discussion about this, about things that you're seeing with our students, perhaps ways that you think that you or other organizations maybe are collaborating well, could collaborate better. Just open it up. Whoever wants to start.
These things are fancy. So I will put a little caveat on this to start with. I am day 18 into the new role with the city of St. Louis. But prior to this, I was working with St. Louis County, and we have many, many districts there in which we were collaborating to ensure that we were addressing the needs of the unhoused or the housing unstable students. I think one of the critical pieces is the continuum of care and the services that can be made available there. That is a body of probably in the city of St. Louis, more than 50 member organizations that cover the gamut. And so that includes social, emotional, behavioral health. School districts are included as well. Funded organizations that provide permanent transitional and emergency sheltering housing options for folks. One of the other key elements, particularly during the pandemic, is the emergency rental assistance program that has come forth that's provided a whole host of assistance dollars to sort of deal with some of the issues that Deidre mentioned earlier, subject to evictions and transition. There are a lot of resources there that we could couple with a number of folks that are being identified to support them and think about partnerships where we can really look at the data and evaluate where is there overlap. One of the key pieces I think about with many of our service providers is how do we break the cycle, right? A child who has stayed in shelter, who's been homeless during their childhood is more than 5 times more likely to be homeless as an adult. That's a startling statistic, but it's the reality based upon trauma, based upon experience, based upon a lack of a social safety net. And the degree to which we sort of identify these issues early and we sort of stop that trend by making sure that they are supported in ways that produce better outcomes for them is important, one of which is education, right? So we have to do, I think, a better job in our continuum of care when we're dealing with these families to not only get them back on their feet, but really check in on how are they being educated, where are they being educated, are they enrolled? So when we talk about attendance, as Dr. Adams has mentioned, all of those things matter. And so I think there are a number of ways that we can connect the dots so that we are speaking on the same page and we are supporting children wherever they show up. We need to improve that communication across the board. In addition to the homeless service system within my department, we have youth and family that are also focus of our work, dealing with issues of trauma and violence and other things. There are a whole host of resources that are coming from the ARPA fund that are going to change the way that this administration is focusing on supporting the human service needs within the community. I'm a physician by trade, and so I'm always thinking about overall mental health and physical health well-being. And so part of the reason why I got into this work was centered around the social determinants of health. And many of the things that have been shared so far are really centered around what's going on outside of the school setting, right? How are we supporting people? And so the work is also around how do we connect the dots with all of these resources to really focus on a common goal of what we're trying to achieve. And the children are our future. I have a 9-year-old son who I would have brought here tonight, but he said, no, Dad, I'm tired of the meetings. But these things are extraordinarily important. And I don't want to take too much of the floor because I can talk for a long period of time. But I did want to say there are a lot of ways that we can very specifically, coming away from this table, improve our coordination, improve our activities so that we can benchmark a year from now when we have another round table, 6 months from now, where are we with that, right? And I think that's really what our office is focused on.
Yeah, thank you, Yusuf. I will just piggyback on that. And we are located just literally your neighbors right here. I really think it's trying to figure out that conduit, that connection for communication between us. And Yusuf mentioned the continuum of care. We can definitely connect that. I'm on that board, and we can try to make sure that we're communicating with SLPS and trying to connect those families to the resources and based on the needs that they have individualized within that family. I guess the one thing I always ask is like, and maybe I missed this at the beginning, I'm sorry I was late, but the need and the severity of need that the problem is. So if we're trying to address a particular issue, a particular problem, do we know the severity? I know we don't know it exactly. It's sometimes abstract, but what have we seen and how can we communicate that need to organizations like St. Patrick's Center and other continuum of care organizations with a warm handoff for the need of that individual family, and the needs differ depending on the family. So I think we can continue that conversation going forward. We just applied for another $800,000 worth of rental assistance program funding. And, that is not only just the rental assistance, direct client aid for families within this area and within the St. Louis city, but also for, trying to acquire and obtain housing for those individuals that don't have it currently, but also to keep them in housing so they don't have the situation where they are living in a situation where it's literally homeless or they're just couch surfing or whatever we want to call it. So, you know, I'm really excited about the fact that we have some funding. Yusuf knows this. He brought up ARPA. There's other ERAP and other that we're getting those individuals as quickly as possible and those families through our housing programs and other continuum of care service provider housing programs. So we're open to that, and I'm looking forward to next steps.
To sort of just double back, because I do think you missed the portion where we were talking about the need quantifiably, because our students who qualify under McKinney-Vento go through a process where, you know, there is an application and that is quantified. It's up to 20% of our students on an annual basis. 20% of our students qualify. Now, as Ms. Thomas Murray said, that definition is broad. I think you said before, it could be somebody with the electricity out. It could be people living who are doubled up in housing. It's also people living in cars, people living in streets, people living in shelters. But all of those people to qualify, it's 20% of our students. But at the same time, I mean, I think about this, and this was a conversation I had with Alderwoman Ingracia, which kind of led to this group. You know, these are kids that we have information about. These are kids that are showing up and have identified as somebody that, you know, their family says, we need help and we want to come to school. And so if there are resources out there to help those kids, we know who they are. And the impact can be tremendous because, as Dr. Adams was saying, you know, just keeping a kid in the same school all year makes a tremendous impact. They build those relationships with their teachers. They have the relationship with the support services, the counselor, the family community specialist, volunteers, which hopefully are coming back soon, you know, mentors that come into the building and play that part, after school providers, all that sort of stuff. A full year is amazing. Now, 2 years is even better. You know, we had an academic presentation at our last meeting, in a couple of our schools that have sort of the highest concentration of poverty. One of their issues, even though they're doing amazing, tremendous, innovative things in that school, is the mobility rate. You know, 75% of the kids may not come back the next year. And all of this kind of plays a part into it. So any additional stability I think that we can provide is what we're looking for.
I was just going to add, you know, I sit at these tables and have conversations, but the reality of it is lack of affordable housing. And so we put families in places where they're faced with challenges of mice infestation and other issues. And so it's still substandard housing. And I think if we're going to be impactful, you know, we have to look at the whole child, family. You know, they are a unit. And if we're going to be impactful, we have to come up with affordable housing and affordable wages as well. And so those are things that we do not have control of as a school district, but we get it and we understand the impact. And, you know, and there may need to be some changes in how families are assessed through 211 and the city and maybe shelter rules, because if they have a male child over 12. And so we talk about trauma, but it's trauma on top of trauma. This child is now being separated from their parent and put into respite or an emergency shelter. And so it's great having everybody at the table, but we got to be real about the issues. And that's one of the challenges. So when their children or the male child is a certain age, they're separated. And so, yeah, that I'm just thinking about an article I wrote, toxicity coupled with toxicity. I forgot why I was crying. And so we see this firsthand, but I'm gonna pause.
Ms. Thomas Murray, if I could just interject quickly, I did not know your name before about a month ago, but in the course of these conversations, I have not had a conversation with one person who was not completely impressed with you. So, so thank you. Thank you for your work. I hope we have the opportunity to work together. And I know that you have also discussed trauma in a less formal setting recently. And I think that's definitely a smart directive in which to move. I will say something that you just mentioned brought about, the district is paralyzed in some respects, but also has the ability to act. So I would encourage you, and I think Dr. Adams is looking at this as well, tax incentives. If tax incentives are granted by my colleagues at the Board of Aldermen or me, there should be a meaningful partnership with the district to make sure that a tax incentive is not just a complete loss to the district. And so please let me know how I can be helpful with that. And we haven't heard from Colleen yet, but I'm not a very smart person. I know how to ask smart people to be around me. So Yusuf, Colleen, and Anthony, all here, all have huge experience and in a really thoughtful way to help figure out how best to address these issues. And I think one of the things that I keep hearing over and over again is there's just not enough places for families to go, or moms and kids, or whatever it is. So keep us posted on how best to address making sure there are available spots for not just individuals, but families themselves.
Yeah, I'll just say one quick thing. So shelter rules are critically important. And so the discriminatory practices you've outlined are abhorrent, and they really aren't speaking to the humanity or the needs of the families. And so those things will change. We'll have conversations with the Continuum of Care and shelter providers about that, because that, particularly when we're thinking about many of those males are Black males, the question becomes why? Why? Why are they feared? Because that's what this is about. So let's have a real conversation. Secondly, we talked about affordable housing being an issue. Obviously, the report that came out about a week and a half ago that really gave some negative ratings for the city and the county relative to affordable housing. That's part of the agenda of the administration. I had the luxury of being on a panel that are reviewing the low-income housing tax credited properties that are being proposed. I think it's also important for us in reference to those legislative priorities is to think about how we lobby MHDC, Missouri Housing Development Corporation, to not just be looking at senior housing. Those are palatable programs and projects, and certainly we need senior housing, but there are a lot of families out here struggling to find a quality, affordable housing as well. And so that's part of the evaluation in terms of the array. So we'll take into account some of the data that you provided today to come to those decisions around how do we have variety in housing types available. This is both a short-term and a long-term sort of issue that we have to address, but certainly providing that full array of needs for those in need is important.
I will also say, don't be satisfied with developers telling you that workforce housing is the way to go, because workforce housing means 80% or above of AMI. It is not affordable housing. It's a completely different thing.
Yeah, I would just jump in and echo and kind of piggyback off of when we talk about like access to affordable housing, we know as a whole that housing is not the only solution to breaking the cycle of homelessness. And so when we're really looking at it, we can stably house individuals, but are we also then providing access to resources to help get them out of living in poverty? And so when we look at access to education. We support young people who are 16 to 24. Many of them are coming to us without having completing their high school education. So we work with St. Louis Public Schools and have the HiSET program on our campus so that young people just have to get up in the morning and go downstairs and are working on their high school diplomas. When they earn their high school diploma, they're more likely to gain employment that has a higher livable wage. So then we work with partners to build employment access for our young people so that they are gaining better employment. When we have long-term stable employment, then we can start saving. We can start saving, we can start putting aside money to then have access to better housing. And so the whole piece of it is making sure that we know who the resources are here sitting at this table, who can provide additional resources beyond just housing. So we're looking at who can help do job training. So if we're starting in the high school age, how can we start doing job training with our young people so that when they leave high school, do we go into the trade field? We know the trade field is really big right now. So how are we making sure that we're bringing people together at the table that have the ability to support students at an even earlier stage, so that then when they go to graduate, when they've got their diploma and two, they're leaving with a skill that helps them become even more employable at a livable wage. So it's a whole piece of it. Affordable housing and access to housing is one piece of it, but we have to go beyond even just talking about housing and the resources that are accessible and making sure we can connect those dots for the families, students, and the community.
So the only thing I would add, and thank you very much for the context, and housing obviously is a critical component, but you gave a data point that said children 5 times more likely to be homeless as adults. So one of the interventions that I think is sorely missing is the notion of case management. How do we keep kids out of the notion of them becoming adults without adequate case management? It happens. Exactly the data point you framed, because they are watching and seeing, and the housing is easy. You give them a home, they get there, but how do you keep them in their housing? By finding them jobs, by giving them the social emotional support, sometimes counseling, that is going to take long-term to keep them out of those places. So as the city rethinks around this process, I would implore them to think critically, especially as it relates to kids, what will be the case management process to support these kids long-term to make sure that they become stable adults who will never have to go back and be homeless?
I'll be short. So that is one of the line items of the ARPA funds, are the case management components, which are critical to really sustainable households moving forward. Another key piece to this conversation is when we're thinking about those critical long-term needs, another population that is most at risk, and Deidre talked about this a little bit as well, as those aging out of foster care. And so that population is Covenant Houses, Will House as well. They are even more likely to become homeless because they have no social safety net, no fabric, no family to call home, et cetera. And so that is another piece in working with the Children's Division that we will employ too. We worked in the county in that way to strengthen that relationship, to make sure that we were outlining who is exiting and how are they connected to resources. There were additional vouchers that were put forward by the Children's Division in partnership with the Housing Authority that we'll tap into as well to support some of those households and the case management that goes with it. Housing authorities are the biggest provider of affordable housing in our region. We have to reduce the number of people being terminated from those vouchers. I repeat, we have to reduce the number that are being terminated from those vouchers. Anything that pipelines people back into homelessness or in the homelessness are the things that we're looking to attack, not just those who are chronically unhoused on the streets.
And that's what I was going to add, Yusuf. Some of those systemic oppressive practices, they have to go. You know, if a family has negative police contact, if their children fight, then their voucher's terminated. And so, you know, it's like, and so now I got to figure out how to get you back into a home. You're talking about a population that's traumatized. And so they're responding to their community. You got to know how to fight if you live in certain neighborhoods. And so some of those things are going to occur. But now the whole house, the entire house is homeless. because of the built-in stuff. And so I think about that when I think about the unaccompanied youth. And these are children without parents who go to college. But then you got out-of-state fees taxed in, and you have application fees, and they don't have a real connect with an adult. And so they're literally surfing without water. And I think the built-in, I always say when Blackness is offensive, an explanation is always required. And so we don't know the reason why a 12-year-old male can't stay with their parent. We have to move from those oppressive practices and go against the grain and just be bold and do something different to accurately and satisfactorily support families. I think her hand's been up. Sorry, I skipped.
No, that's fine. I am new to this conversation and relatively new to this role as the Parent Action Council chair. So I have more of like a question of clarification or understanding. Is there currently a mechanism or any kind of protocol for communication between St. Louis Public Schools, the city, any of the partners that are participating in this continuum of care, which I'm reading about as we're talking about it? If a child is identified or a family is identified as homeless or being in need of these services, is there any current protocol for collaboration or communication that is triggered better, or what do the people around this table need to improve that process, to strengthen those relationships, to ensure that we're getting those services to those families?
So let me say this, our families have the right to privacy. And so when they show up in our office, we encourage them to make calls in our presence as an effort to make sure they're linked with those supports and those services. We have what's called the needs assessment. And on that form, there's various questions. And once those families tell us what they need, we make sure they leave with that contact and those informations. So we use the St. Louis Resource Handbook. We use 211. And I think one of our partnerships that work for us is Ameren. They reserve some spots for St. Louis public school students. And I think if collectively or collaboratively that were a practice, rather than saying dial 211 or do this, give us some access. And I think it will make a little more impact.
So like ideally, if more businesses or more services like Ameren reserved spots for SLPS families, knowing that we have such a high need, that could be a way that we could improve access for our families.
Oh, of course. I mean, even within our district, our early childhood program, they save some spots for our homeless children. And so, you know, the only way to effect change is to put some changes in place, change those practices.
I think that's a great question. I think that everybody at the table today has an opportunity to reinvest and take a good look at how we are collaborating, because there is some collaboration happening on the surface, but it's not as deep and meaningful as it needs to be. You know, to Ms. Thomas Murray's point, we don't have enough spaces for kids and families to, you know, stay safely in places. We've got a lot of great things happening, but there's just such room for improvement. And I'm very excited about the new administration at the mayor's office. I'm excited that Yusuf is the head of human services now. And we have Colleen and Anthony here, who are also committed from, a professional standpoint and a compassionate standpoint in working really well with the unhoused community. I think we're just scratching the surface of what we can do well together.
I think one of the points of collaboration that we can encourage is full service community schools. I know Dr. Adams has made a commitment to expanding. We have 4 now, but trying to expand that to 8. In the past, the city of St. Louis contributed to that, and then it stopped a few administrations ago. We would just encourage the Board of Aldermen and our legislative partners to look at that as part of the solution.
And is that via Prop S or other funding?
It previously was Prop S, that is correct.
Okay, thank you.
Just wanted to add on, just to follow up, there's with collaboration with Yusuf, DFS, the mayor's office, for the last 6 months or so, there's been a new technology application software that we've been utilizing at the Continuum of Care within service providers. And we're still working through the kinks, but it is an application that will hopefully be able to give access to families quicker to potential opportunities or occupancies in bed availability for shelters. So we're trying to really decrease the vacancy rate of our shelters, increase the occupancy rate, and make sure that we don't have any empty shelter beds or facilities. So that's coming using technology to help solve some of that. But it's moving forward, and we'll keep working together on that.
I was just going to add, in my mind, I'm working on an app so homeless families can know what resources and supports are near them, but it's still in my mind.
Well, I think this can actually do that. So we'll talk more about how that could work.
You lost your opportunity to make a lot of money there. Yeah. By just a hot second. Yeah.
There's not that much money in homeless services. I'm just going to tell you, in case you didn't know.
I wanted to see if anybody else in the audience has anything to add. I also do want to point out that we have our lobbyist, Steve Carroll, who's our lobbyist in Jefferson City, who is joining us by Zoom. We can't see him here, but he is watching us and hearing us. And Steve, is there anything that you want to add from the Jefferson City perspective?
Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you for allowing me to be a part of this and listen in. I think this is absolutely a great meeting, very informative. I would just say, from a Jefferson City standpoint and dealing with the legislature, it's about educating the legislators on the unique challenges that the St. Louis Public Schools face. And I try to do that every year. I can recall last session, it was a very tough session, and the Senate Education Chair lady, we had a bill up before, and she was kind of acknowledging she thought the St. Louis Public Schools did a poor job academically, unaccredited, provisionally accredited, and so forth. And I pointed out during the testimony, it's unfortunate because the St. Louis Public Schools are doing so much more than just trying to educate the children and all the surrounding services that we try to provide them. Unfortunately, we're the only ones as a school district getting graded, unaccredited, provisionally accredited, or accredited. We're not accrediting or unaccrediting the societal problems around the school district in which we're dealing with. I mean, how would we judge society in dealing with gang violence? I'd say pretty much unaccredited. How would we judge a legislature in trying to deal with gun violence? I'd say unaccredited. And yet we're the only ones getting judged on it. And it's unfortunate because, as was pointed out tonight, we're really providing social services to our children and trying to help them. I think that's one of the provisions in our legislative platform where I think we should have a weighted average daily attendance factor for students with high mobility in districts or for homelessness. And I know that when we rewrote the foundation formula in 2005, never before had we had a weighted average daily attendance factor for English as second language. students, and we were able to get that in. So I think if we start tweaking with the formula, I think we can do it in a way to try to help get additional resources that we need to truly educate our children, and also to give them the services that they need to help them get that education. So, it'll be another challenge, as you know, Mr. Chairman, going into a new legislative session, but we're certainly going to make sure that the legislature knows our unique challenges.
Well, Mr. Carroll, if you can get us in front of a hearing, I've already promised Ms. Thomas Murray that we're taking a field trip to Jeff City next year. And anybody else that wants to join, feel free, because I do think we are very unique. I mean, there's certainly homeless children in Butler County, but they're affected differently than we are here. So it's not like this problem doesn't happen everywhere else. It's just of a different intensity. And I think those personal stories help. And there's a lot we can do on the local level too, as I think just this conversation has already started. I do like to keep a promise that we keep these to an hour. If anybody has anything else that they think we've forgotten, or anybody that hasn't spoken, speak now or forever hold your peace. Please, Jordan.
I think one critical issue to look at when you talk about the trauma that kids see every day, I think you have to talk about adult education, because if they're seeing the negative and it's having an effect on them in a negative way, if they see their parent taking soft skill classes for de-escalation. So when you have children that may be on the verge of fighting, a parent that can de-escalate, or a parent that is new on a job and hasn't had a job and doesn't know how to take criticism. I think that it's an acute problem. Like every fall and winter, we do coat drives, and you think about the families that are in shelters and that are homeless because it's cold outside. Not that we don't think about them year round, but it becomes a big point of interest at this time of year. But it's also a long-term issue that you have to think about. If I'm 16 and I can get into your program and I can finish my diploma and go to college, or at least have those opportunities, but you also have to think about the 6-year-old that has another 12 years in their environment. I think the only thing that, one of the things that can really help them is seeing my parent, my guardian, whoever is giving me some sort of adult care, seeing them make an effort to better themselves. I'm sure a lot of these parents don't want to be in that situation, especially with young children. So providing adult education to the parents so that their children can see someone that's striving for a better life for not only themselves, but for their children, can possibly lower that rate of a child that has been homeless 5 times. Even if you make it 2 times, it's still too much, but we've lessened that problem. So I think that adult education is something that should really be in the picture, a big part of it as well, providing those parents, providing those adults some of the skills that they didn't even know they needed. When you're living in trauma day in and day out, like you said, you got to know how to fight. You got to know how to you're surviving. But if you can give them the skills to say, once you get a job and someone says, hey, you didn't do this right, it's not an attack. It's not something where you need to defend yourself to the point where you lose that job and you get right back into the situation. So I think that while we look at the children and getting them into housing and fixing that acute problem, and we all know this, that it's that long term for everybody, not just the children who are going to grow up into these adults, but these adults who are going to have so much in their minds just about raising a child, but then themselves as well. Like, I want my child to be as a productive member of society, but I also want that for myself too. So I think we have to keep the parents in mind too. And that adult education piece is very key.
I think that's, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say thank you so much, Jordan, for, you remind me of the supports and efforts that we do put in place at St. Louis Public Schools. And so we've partnered with, I can't recall the name of the agency. Things went a little south during the pandemic, but there was a partnership with an agency to go in and teach those soft skills and the natural nurturing stuff to parents. And so some of the programs, there was a point we were having a Let's Talk conversations here, in fact, in this room. But then I thought, let's try to impact as many parents as we can. And so we sent the services to the shelters where the families were. And so that's an excellent point. If the child is hurting, I can almost assure you mama's hurting. And most children who witness trauma, they're preoccupied with how their mom is while they're in school. And so it's increased anxiety. There are challenges that homelessness is an entity of itself and it has many faces. And so that collaboration, it just needs to occur. And I know that St. Patrick's Center had parenting classes. I went through their program when I came here homeless by way of Hurricane Katrina. So the key is getting them to access those services. Back to Dr. Adams' point, that case management piece. There has to be follow-up. We do have a case manager in our Students in Transition office, but we only have one. And we have over 3,000 homeless students identified. And I can assure you there's another 3,000 unidentified. And so it's the collaboration that's going to make.
Also on December 11th, by email, but the next step of the committee is to take legislative priorities and present them to the community. We'll be inviting our city legislators as well as some from county, the Jefferson city legislators, as well as our board of aldermen and other community members, our community partners. We're going to present our legislative priorities. We actually have more than three because we don't even include tax abatement and social reform anymore. It's something that we need to add because we're always advocating for receiving of the full funding that the taxpayers have authorized that we receive to educate the students. And so we really hope that you